Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf nun. Okay, today's daf, I will warn you, it's a little bit complicated and long-winded. I made an elaborate study guide that I'm hoping will help everybody. It's one of those things that I think if you're learning along with me, the chart will be helpful. Might be confusing otherwise to other people, but I'm hoping it will be useful. And if you generally listen while you're doing something else, you might want this time to try to take a look at the study guide. I think it will be very useful. So we started yesterday with this siman of hekesh, gezeira, shava, kavachomer, binyan. We're now going to do all the permutations of this. Okay, we started with something you learn by hekesh. Can it teach you hekesh? Right? And I'm going to already start sharing the screen because I did a summary also on the chart of what we did in yesterday's daf. So we had davar lamei behekesh. Could you learn after you learn one hekesh? Could you go to another hekesh? You can see from this chart, and I'll explain to you how it's organized. On the right-hand side, you have things that are learned by hekesh, or learned by gezeira shava, or learned by kavachomer, and that's going to be the order the sugya is going to go. And then it's going to go for each one through the list. Can you do hekesh, then hekesh? Can you do hekesh, then gezeira shava? Can you do hekesh, then kavachomer? Can you do hekesh, then binyan? Let's just review what all these things are. Hekesh is two things are near each other in the pasuk, and we learn from the juxtaposition. Gezeira shava, same word appears in one place, it appears somewhere else. We're going to learn from one to the other. Kavachomer, it's kavachomer argument, right? If the light one is like this, and the more strict one would be like this, or the reverse it could be, right? The strict one has an easy law, so obviously the light one has an easy law. Binyan, paradigm, okay? Anything that's similar to it, we can learn from it. So we're going to do, we started already with davar lamei behekesh. Now, the other thing to understand about this chart, this is only for the world of kodashim, because kodashim has its own world. Just like we had the everything, something's repeated, it means it's essential, right? But if not, it's not. That's a unique principle for the world of sacrifices, okay? It's kind of the only thing we really have where we have a whole category of things, of sacrifices, the world of sacrifices, where the laws are different than in other places. So the laws of these derivations, these halakhic principles, are also different. So you could, outside of the world of kodashim, learn a hekesh and then another hekesh. Now, before we even get to this daf, I just want to show you, okay, what I did was, first of all, I numbered all the cases that we're going to talk about, 12 altogether today. Tomorrow there'll be a whole nother level to the chart because we didn't get to the binyan av yet. We'll do that tomorrow. But I numbered them because we're going to refer back to them. Different places, you can see there's numbers throughout where it's saying, oh, this refers back to that one. Okay? And I underlined the names of the rabbis because I believe the Gemara thought you were going to get confused as well, and they thought the easy way to remember it is when we go back to a case, we'll mention who's the rabbi who gave the drasha there. And then it'll keep going back, oh, like Ravina and Rava said, and it's referring to this first one where Ravina and Rava come into play. Or where Rabbi Yochanan said, and it's referring to case 2 where Rabbi Yochanan is there. So they keep reminding you who said what. It might actually cause some confusion to you, but I think it was meant to make things clearer to people. Like if you remember that Rabbi Yochanan was the one who said this, and you remember which case we're talking about. I thought charting it out and giving it numbers was a more clear way of organizing. So let's start our cases. So yesterday we have the davar lamei behekesh. If you learn it by hekesh, you can't learn another hekesh, which we've been talking about for a long time, but we never saw the source, and now we had two possible sources, Ravina and Rava. Ravina says it's because it says shachata tekeves, b'mkom asher shachata techatat ve'tola. Why does it have to mention chatat? It's clearly not learning it from there. It's learning it from the ola, and it wants to tell you, oh yeah, we couldn't have learned it from chatat, because chatat was learned out from a hekesh to ola, and then we can't learn a hekesh from asham to chatat. From chatat to asham. So that's one. And Rava said it's from the kasher yuram mishor zevachim, which was that whole thing with the par. It had to be as if it was written explicitly by paralim davar shel tzibur, so that we could learn from the sirei avodah zarah, even though it wasn't really written explicitly. But it had to be, it was learned by hekesh, and therefore if we want to learn a hekesh and a hekesh, it wouldn't really work. So we had to add this extra phrase to say it's as if it's learned explicitly. Because if it wasn't as if, it wouldn't have worked. So either which way, we have hekesh can't teach hekesh. Then we had hekesh can't teach gezeira shava. Once you learn something by hekesh, like our classic example is going to be the chatat from the ola, is learned because they're in the same pasuk. Then, if you wanted to just learn to asham, you could have learned to asham from gezeira shava, from kodashim. It says by chatat kodashim, it says by asham kodashim. You could have learned from one to the other. The fact that they didn't do that, and they had to come up with this, comparison to the ola, is because right? They had to have a pasuk that compared it to ola, because kodashim wouldn't have been enough, because, again, that would be gezeira shava, learned after about something that was learned by hekesh. You can't have a hekesh, then gezeira shava. But now we're going to get to davar lamei behekesh, chozer lamei bekal v'chomer. But you actually can start with a hekesh and then go to a kal v'chomer argument. How do we know this? We actually learned this. Where did we learn it? You might not remember this, but in those complicated, also a little confusing dapim about the par, and why does it say the word par, and what do we learn from all this? So if you remember, midatani debei Rabbi Yishmael, that's all they tell you, okay? But on daf mem aleph amud aleph, there was that confusing kal v'chomer of Rabbi Yishmael, if you remember, which was we had to figure out what exactly it meant. If you have two sacrifices, if you remember, that were brought, it starts at the bottom of mem amud bet, two sacrifices that are brought from different animals and yet have the same actions, then two sacrifices brought from the same animal are obviously going to have the same laws. And which ones were we learning to? That the parlim davar shel tzibor has the laws of et b'dam b'tfilah, which we learned actually from a hekesh of the par and the parlim davar shel tzibor and the par kohen HaMashiach. So that's your hekesh. And from there we got to this logical argument that if it's true for the parlim davar shel tzibor, which was learned out by hekesh, it will be true also for the par Yom Kippurim because of this kal v'chomer, because they're the same animals. If two different animals have the same laws, then two of the same animals obviously have the same laws. So there we had a hekesh and a kal v'chomer, and you might remember this, you might not remember this, but the Gemara asks, "V'chi davar lamei behekesh." I'm at the top of Mem Aleph Amud Aleph. Chozer lamei bekal v'chomer. Could you really do this? Have a hekesh and then a kal v'chomer? And Rav Papa answered, Kasavar Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael. Yes, okay. Davar lamei behekesh, chozer lamei bekal v'chomer. Obviously, Rav Papa says that Tana debei Yishmael thought that you could do this, and there we have. So, not to say everyone agrees, but for sure the Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael thought so, and that's what they bring. They don't actually bring a dissenting opinion here. We will see in some of the cases dissenting opinions. So hekesh is not so easy, because once you have a hekesh, you really can't learn other things. Again, all in the world of kodashim, we're talking about. But you could actually learn a kal v'chomer. Now this is going to come into play, this difference between the hekesh can't do hekesh, you can't do a hekesh on a hekesh, you can't do gezeira shava on a hekesh, but you can do a kal v'chomer on a hekesh, is going to come into play later in some of our arguments. You're going to see that to get to the answers to these questions, the rabbis are either going to use drashot that they know about, or they're going to use logical arguments like kal v'chomer arguments. Like if it worked there, and that worked, and that didn't work there, then obviously this and this one, this case number 3 is going to come into play a lot. Okay, next. Davar lamei behekesh ma'ushi lamei binyan av. Can you learn a binyan av? Can you make a paradigm from it? So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Lo lichtov tzafona ba'asham v'titem binyan av mechatat. You could have simply said, okay, we're back to our asham case. Don't write north in asham, meaning don't have a pasuk slaughter the keves in the place where you slaughter the chatat and the olah and learn it from there. And you could have just learned it from a paradigm of chatat. The fact that we don't, and we have to have a special pasuk, right? Because chatat and asham are pretty similar, so you could have built a paradigm. Now, how do paradigms work? They work as long as there's no logical argument to say, oh, that one's more stringent, so you can't learn from there to there. So right now he says, you could have learned a binyan av from chatat. So lamai chatat katve. So why did the Torah go out of its way to bring a special pasuk to teach you that the asham has to be in the north? Lav lamemer, is it not to say the davar lamei behekesh ein chozer lamei bebinyan av? So he thinks it's telling you no, this doesn't work. How do we know it doesn't work? Because we wouldn't have needed the pasuk for the asham being in the north from the olah. We could have just learned it from the chatat. But the Gemara doesn't like Rabbi Yirmiyah. They reject him, and therefore we're left kind of without an answer here. Okay, we're going to see a few teku, like a teku later. And actually there's going to be 2 tekus. So this is like a teku. Okay, the Gemara doesn't say teku, but it does reject Rabbi Yirmiyah in the following way. And it's going to be a bit of a long, the first rejection is kind of simple, and then we'll get a little bit off on a tangent, and then we'll get back to our topic. So for this, we're going to go actually to the chart at the bottom, at the second side of the sheet. V'lit amech, but if you want to say you could do a binyan av from asham, Teitemi binyan av me'ola. Forget that. That wouldn't prove anything, because you could have said, I don't need to learn it, build a paradigm from chatat, build a paradigm from ola, and then you wouldn't be able to learn, something learned by hekesh. You could then do a paradigm, because the ola, it says it explicitly there, that it's in the north. So my time lo ate. Now, why didn't you suggest that? Well, because you couldn't have made a paradigm from Ola, why not? And then he's going to say, for that same reason, you can't make a paradigm from Chatat. And your proof is not a good proof, because there was no option of a paradigm, not by Ola and not by Chatat. So why? Because Mala Ola Shekin Kalil. The Ola is completely burnt. That makes it more stringent. Again, you can't build a paradigm if the item is more, the object is more stringent. Chatanami Kalamifrach Mala Chatat Shekin Mechaper Achayve Kritut. You also can't learn it from a sin offering because, so this argument against Rabbi Yirmiyah is, why didn't you suggest Ola, and then you wouldn't have been able to learn anything, because that's not learned out from a hekesh, because it completely gets burnt, and it's more strict than Asham. But so is a Chatat. A Chatat is mechaperet on chayve kritut, on things that you're liable karet for. That's more serious than things you bring an Asham for. So therefore, answer being, that's already the rejection of Rabbi Yirmiyah. You can't say that it could have used a paradigm from Chatat because it couldn't have. Now, some people say, this is just off on a tangent now. They're just saying, let's think about these three things. How could the Torah potentially, instead of having a special drasha for, right, Ola, it says it explicitly, Chatat's learned out from Ola and a hekesh, and Asham is learned out from a hekesh to Ola. Why did you need all that? Couldn't you have built a paradigm? Now, we just said you can't build a paradigm from Ola, you can't build it from Chatat, but maybe you could have built the paradigm from 2 to learn the third. And we're going to go through all the possible options. Could the Torah have written it by Asham and Chatat and learned to Ola? Could it have written it by Ola and Asham and learned to Chatat? Could it have written by Ola and Chatat and learned to Asham? So we're going to do all three, and we're going to say each time that each pair of 2 has a stringency that doesn't exist in the third, and that's why they couldn't have learned by paradigm, and that's why the Torah had to say it explicitly in one place, hekesh to the other 2 in other places. So let's see how they go. So clearly you couldn't have learned one from the other, but you could have learned one from 2 possibly. So which ones could you have? Now they're going to reject all of them. This no longer has to do with the flow of the Gemara. Okay, we're out of it. You could have not had it by Ola and just written it in Chatat and Asham, and you would have learned to Ola. But no, because Chatat and Asham atone for sins. Ola, now we did say the Ola atones for mitzvot aseh you didn't do, but it doesn't atone for negative transgressions that you did. Let's suggest, maybe don't write it by Chatat and learn from Ola and Asham. But the animals you bring are male animals for an Ola and Asham, and for a Chatat it's female animals. So you couldn't have necessarily built a paradigm from those to the Chatat. Last one, maybe it didn't say an Asham, it would have said an Ola and Chatat, and you could have learned. But what's common to Ola and Chatat? They both can be individual offerings, but they also can be brought as communal offerings. There's communal Olot Riyah, for example, that you bring on the regalim, on the holidays. Chatat, there's the Chatat Parlim Devrishal Tzibor, that's a communal offering. And Asham never comes as a communal offering. It's always just individual. Okay, so that doesn't work. Okay, so anyway, let's summarize our whole first section. Davar lamei behekesh. Once you learn one thing from juxtaposition, you cannot do another juxtaposition. You cannot do gezeira shava on that. Otherwise, we could have done kodashim from the Asham, from the Chatat to the Asham. You can learn a kavachomer, as we did from the Parlim Devrishal Tzibor to the Par Yom Kippurim, with the Epidam and Tefillah, those 3 laws. And binyan av looks like we don't really know. Okay, Rabbi Yirmiyah said no, but they rejected, but it's not really clear because then nobody has a proof either which way. Okay. Next, now we're on the second part of the chart. Davar lamei b'gezeira shava. If you have something that's a gezeira shava, can you then, and now we're going to go, can you learn a hekesh after that? Can you learn a gezeira shava on a gezeira shava? Can you learn a kavachomer on a gezeira shava? So, and can you learn a binyan av on a gezeira shava? So we're going to go through those 4 cases now. So davar lamei b'gezeira shava maushi lamei behekesh. Can you make a hekesh? So Rav Papa is going to say yes, you can. Okay, why? Amar Rav Papa. By the way, the more we get through the chart, the more we're going to have yes, yes, yes. Okay, we start off with davar lamei behekesh. It's almost completely no or unsure, and only one yes. Davar lamei b'kavachomer is going to be yes across the board. Okay, once you have a kavachomer, you can darshan another kavachomer, no problem. Okay, and you can do a gezeira shava, you could do a hekesh, you could do a binyan av. All of those is going to be yes. And the gezeira shava is going to be yes, 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 maybe though no. Okay, we're going to have one argument. The first we're going to have a yes and a no. Then we're going to have yes, yes, and we don't know. Okay? So you can see how the progression is. It gets a little easier to do these things as we go along. So if it's learned from gezeira shava, can you learn by hekesh? Amar Papa, v'zot torat zevach hashlamim imal toda. So in this pasuk, it's talking about shlamim, and then it says in the next pasuk, but it's juxtaposed because it's right there, well, if you're doing a korban toda, which is a type of shlamim. So there's a juxtaposition between shlamim and toda, and we're going to see that this juxtaposition is going to teach you a halacha that was learned out already from gezeira shava. Okay? So what are we learning? What's the halacha? Lamanu letoda sheba min maasil. Usually maaser sheni money, you can use only to buy chulin stuff that's not sanctified. Or, sorry, I didn't say that right. When you buy an animal for a korban, you usually buy it from chulin money. But what if your money was maaser sheni money? You bring it to Jerusalem. Can you buy a korban toda with it? And the answer is yes. Okay? Why? Well, because since shlamim can come from maaser, which we're going to see in a minute, comes from gezeira shava, and the shlamim is juxtaposed to the toda, so we can learn from toda to shlamim, from shlamim, that's a hekesh, after we already had a gezeira shava. So even though we're only going to hear the gezeira shava at the end, the gezeira shava obviously comes first. So again, we learned a toda can come from maaser because shlamim can come from maaser sheni money. Shlamim, because remember, you bring your stuff to Jerusalem, you have to buy things in Jerusalem, so you can buy an animal to bring a korban toda with. Gufayhu, you can't usually do that. You can't really buy an animal for a sacrifice from your maaser sheni money, but you can for a shlamim and you can for a toda. So shlamim gufayhu menalam, where do we get that from? Dichtiv sham sham. So it says sham in the pasuk about the shlamim, v'savachta shlamim v'achalta sham, and then it says by maaser, you eat your maaser, kol mashe yivchar l'shaken shmo sham. So gezeira shava from shlamim, from maaser to shlamim, that teaches you can buy shlamim with your maaser sheni money, and because it's a hekesh from shlamim to toda, you can do that with a toda also. That's Rav Papa's proof. Merzutra doesn't like this, and that's why we're going to have two answers here, and we're going to come back to this later. So remember, there's Rav Papa, and then there's someone who disagrees. Amar le Merzutra berei de Rav Meri le Ravina. So Merzutra, the son of Rav Meri, says to Ravina, so I'm also on the previous stuff, he says, Masir dagan chulin ba'almahu. Wait a minute, you can't learn. This whole chart that we're talking about is only in the world of kodashim. Masir sheni isn't kodashim, it's chulin. Okay, we always call it mamon of the Baalim. It's their own property. It doesn't have sanctity to it. It's not, even if you say it has sanctity, it's not a sacrificial item. So the gezeira shava is coming from something that's chulin. So this doesn't fit in our chart at all. It's not relevant because it's not kodashim. So Amar lei, so Rav Papa answers him back. Amar lamei kodesh lamei kodesh. Okay, and Rashi says, he's saying this is a question. You need the lamei to be kodesh and the melamei kodesh, right? Rashi says, bitmiya, as a question. As long as the shlamim, which is the item you learned to, is kodashim, and then from there to toda, you don't need the original item to be kodashim for it to fall into the category of the rules of kodashim. So basically, Rav Papa sticks with his original statement, but there are those who disagree and don't think that. Okay, so that one is a machloket, yes or no. Maybe you can learn gezeira shava and then hekesh, maybe you can't. Davar lamei b'gezeira shava, maushi lamei b'gezeira shava. Can you do gezeira shava and gezeira shava? So for this, you can see we're going to have two answers, Rami Bar Chama, and then we're going to have Rava. And that's because Ravina is going to have a problem with Rami Bar Chama's, and therefore Rava is going to bring a different one. So we're going to start with Rami Bar Chama, and we're talking about the mincha that goes with the korban toda. Okay, there's all these breads that go with the korban toda, and one of them is called murbechet, kind of like a bagel. You boil it first, and then you bake it in the oven. Okay, so solet murbechet. Amarami bar Chama Tanya. Solet murbechet. Lamanu l'rivucha sheba solet. Okay, calls the murbechet solet. From there we learn it has to be made from this fine flour. Now in the pasuk about the korban toda, it says, this is the imal toda that we used before for the hekesh. It says, you bring with your zevach toda chalot matzot, belulot bashemen. Okay, so you bring these chalot matzot. Sounds like an oxymoron, chalot matzot. Chalot doesn't mean chalot, what we call chalas. It means loaves of matzah. Then it says rikike matzot meshuchim b'shem, and these are different types of mincha offerings. We'll get to all this when we learn menachot. And solet morbechet chalot b'lo b'shemen. So we have 3 types, but only by the morbechet does it say solet. So how do we know chalot minayin? Talmud lomar chalot gezeira shava. So we're going to learn chalot have to be made from solet, because it says, I don't know if you caught this, but solet morbechet chalot b'lo b'shemen. The matzot are called, right? They're called chalot matzot, and they're also called, the morbechet is called morbechet chalot. So because chalot appears by the morbechet type, which is made from solet, and the word chalot appears in the matzot, the chalot matzot, so the chalot matzot are made from solet. Rikikim minayin, so that's the first gezeira shava. Now we're going to learn for rikikim, they're also made from solet, from gezeira shava. Talmud lomar, rikikim minayin, Talmud lomar, matzot. Well, it calls the chalot matzot, and it calls the rikikim matzot. So what do you have here? That gezeira shava. So now you have gezeira shava from chalot to rikikim, and we had gezeira shava from revucha to chalot. So chalot was learned from gezeira shava, and then it taught gezeira shava to the rikikim. So what would be the problem with this? Well, Amarle Ravina, and then that proves gezeira shava and gezeira shava works. But Ravina says, what do you mean? Maybe the matzot isn't the same matzot in this pasuk. The matzot by the rikikim is learned out not from the chalot matzot, which was derived by a gezeira shava. It could be from a completely different pasuk in a completely different section about menachot, which says, Ki takriv korban mincha ma'afet tanur, another type of mincha offering called the one baked in the oven. Solet chalot matzot blulot b'shemen, urikike matzot meshuchim b'shemen. So there it says solet and matzot, and it says it explicitly. And maybe that's the matzot that teaches us back to the rikikim, in which case it's a gezeira shava on an explicit halacha and not a gezeira shava on a gezeira shava. So because of that, Elama Rava brings a different one. Ditanya. Vikirbo upirsho v'hotzi. Now we're talking about the Par Kohen HaMashiach. Par Kohen HaMashiach, remember, these are called the Parim HaNisrafim, because what you do is you take them completely outside Jerusalem and you burn them in the Beit HaDeshen. Now the pasuk that says that says, listen, at or hapar, the hide of the bull, et kol b'saro, all of its meat, al rosho v'al kra'av, remember these words, we're going to get back to it, on its head and on its thighs, vikirbo upirsho, and the innards, and the perish is the waste that's inside the innards. In other words, if there's waste inside the body that never came out before the animal was killed, it all gets burnt, the whole thing, okay, including the perish. So now it says, vikirbo upirsho v'hotzi, and then it says, right, so you have the kirbo, the innards, and the feces that's inside there, and you have to take it out. Milamed, right, because the next pasuk says, v'hotzi et kol apar, the next word after pirsho is, v'hotzi et kol apar el mechutz lamachaneh. You have to take the whole animal outside the camp, meaning outside Jerusalem. Milamed shemotzio shalem. From here you have the fact that these parts are still together, like the perish is in the kerev. We say it must be you take the entire animal out as one whole animal. That's not so important yet. Yachol yisrafenu shalem. The Braita continues. You might have thought we burn this whole. Ne'amar kan rosho krav. So, if you're going to carry it out whole, maybe also burn it whole. Say no, because ne'amar kan rosho krav. Because the rosh and the kraim, as we saw before, here's our gezeira shava. It says it here, there's the first gezeira shava. And those words appear, ne'amar lahalan, rosho krav, they appear by a regular ola offering that you're supposed to burn the whole animal on the inner altar, right? This is different. It gets burnt inside. But the same words appear there. And there, it says in the pasuk, 2 things. You have to chop it up into pieces, nituach, and you have to do hefshet. You have to take off the hide and cut it into pieces. So, first they learn, mala halana yedei nituach. So just like there, you have to cut it up into pieces before you burn it. Av kana yedei nituach. Also, this one has to be burnt by once you cut it into pieces first. You don't burn it whole. Well, if you're going to learn it from the Ola, this is a side question, not related to our topic, really. I mean, our topic is gezeira shava on a gezeira shava. So we have the first gezeira shava. We learn nituach from the Ola. Well, maybe you have to take the hide off, just like you do on the Ola. If we're learning it all from the Ola, this gezeira shava, why don't we learn it completely? Now that's because Talmud Lomar vikirbo pirsho. Then we're going to take those words vikirbo pirsho, and we're going to learn from them, okay, that you don't do hefshet. Okay, so that's not clear. How do you get from there to there? This is all parenthetical, not important for what we're looking for, because we want a gezeira shava and then another gezeira shava. So we'll get there very soon. But my Talmud, how do we get from kirbo v'pirsho? Amar Rav Papa, kashem shebirsho b'kirbo, kach b'saro ba'oro. Okay, it says the or and the basal, and the kerev and the perish. Now the perish is inside the kerev, right? It's in the innards. Likewise, the flesh has to be inside the or, inside the skin. So therefore, when you burn it, you burn that and that and that and that. Okay, and therefore you don't take the hide off. You burn the hide with it. Okay, that, like I said, was an aside. So the first thing we learn is, when you burn the par kohen Mashiach outside, you burn it with nituach, chopping it up into parts, and that is all learned from Rosho Kra'ag Zereshava from Ola. Vitanya, and there's a braita that says, Rebbe Omer, Ne'amal Kan. Now what's the Kan? Kan is in the par se'ir of Yom Kippurim. We're now going to learn from the par kohen Mashiach to the par Yom Kippurim from gezeira shava. So we're going to have a gezeira shava and a gezeira shava that's going to teach you that the par Yom Kippurim also has this law that you do nituach and not have shade. Okay? Really the more important for our purposes being the nituach. You have to cut into pieces because that's learned from gezeira shava, which is right to the par kohen Mashiach, which was learned from gezeira shava to the Ola, from the Ola. Okay, so that's what we're going to have now. Ne'amar Kan. By the pasuk of the par Yom Kippurim, it says or ubasar uperesh. They're all mentioned in the pasuk that you have to burn the hide, the meat, and the waste. V'ne'amar lahalan, and it also says, turning out Amud Bet, it also says by the par kohen Mashiach, as we saw in the pasuk, or ubasar uperesh. Ma lahalan yedei nituach shelo be'hafshet, av kana yedei nituach shelo be'hafshet. So there we had a gezeira shava on a gezeira shava. Okay, next. Davar lamei b'gezeira shava, ma'u sheyeh lamei b'kav hachomer. Okay, so can you do, so just to review right now, gezeira shava. Once you have a gezeira shava, can you do a hekesh? Rav Papa says no. Rav Papa says yes. Mar Zutra had a difficulty with it and possibly, seems like no. Can you do a gezeira shava and a gezeira shava? Yes. Either from the solet murbechet to the chalot to the rikikin, or maybe it's not learned from there, so then we get the par kohen Mashiach, the par Yom Kippurim is learned from the par kohen Mashiach, which is learned from the Ola, and you have gezeira shava on a gezeira shava. So that is yes, for either that reason or that reason. Davar lamei b'gezeira shava ma'u sheyeh lamei b'kav hachomer. So they're going to now use, and here's going to start our slew of kav hachomer arguments, which is going to be all the next few arguments. Okay, so get ready. Here's where it starts to get a little confusing, but this is where the numbers play an important role. And what I said before about the order of severity, right? The hekesh is the most difficult one because it seems not able to learn. It means it's not as strong, so you really can't learn. Once something's learned by a hekesh, doesn't really allow you so much to learn other things, except it does allow you to learn a kav hachomer. So that's where the logic's going to be here. It's a kav hachomer argument, which is kind of ironic. We're trying to know, can you learn, right? Davar lamei b'gezeira shava, can you learn a kav hachomer? And the way we're getting to it is from a kav hachomer argument. Uma hekesh she'eino malameh behekesh. That's case one. You can't learn a hekesh to a hekesh, and the Gemara is telling you, and I think the Gemara is doing this as a reminding. Okay, so if you remember Rav and Ravina, you'll remember which case we're talking about. They're trying to, like for me, it was easier to say numbers and look back at the chart. Okay, but they don't have charts in their, when they learn. So what they say, and they're going to keep doing this every time they mention a case, they're going to say either from Rava or from Ravina. Remember Rav and Ravina and their proofs, right? Anyway, point being, go back to case one. Can't do another hekesh. And yet, here comes our kav hachomer argument, milameh b'kav hachomer. Even though you can't do a hekesh on a hekesh, you can do a kav hachomer on a hekesh. So, and how do we know that? Midatana de Rabbi Yishmael. They're just reminding you again. So you remember which one we're talking about. Case number 3, epidam tefillah was learned from a kav hachomer, which was learning a law that was derived from a hekesh. So gezeira shava, hamilamedet behekesh, midarav papa. Now we go to case 5. If you have a gezeira shava, which is the case we're looking for, we want to know, can a gezeira shava teach, can you have a gezeira shava and then a kav hachomer? Well, if you look at case 5 and you compare it to case 1, right, those are the same thing. One is hekesh, can you have a hekesh on it? Or gezeira shava, can you then have a hekesh? So the answer is yes, right? From Rav Papa, he says, yes, you can do a hekesh on a gezeira shava. So, eino din shetilameh b'kav hachomer, right? If a gezeira shava allows a hekesh after it, and a hekesh didn't allow a hekesh after it, and yet a hekesh you could do then a kavachomer from it. So obviously, gezeira shava, you should be able to do a kavachomer. So, right? Eino din shetelamei kavachomer. Obviously, after gezeira shava, you should be able to learn a kavachomer. Because the kavachomer seems to be the easiest one. How is it the easiest one? Because of this, right? Because the first category we had, right, in the first section, where hekesh, you couldn't do anything after a hekesh except for a kavachomer. So kavachomer must be the easiest one to say yes to. Okay? So therefore, in gezeira shava, which already works, you can do a hekesh on gezeira shava. Shouldn't you be able to do a kavachomer on gezeira shava? Now, obviously, this is only going to work if you hold by Rav Papa. Because in case 5, if you remember, there was a machloket. Rav Papa said the Toda, you can learn from there from the Maser Sheni to the Shlamim to the Toda. But Mar Zutra said, no, that's chulin, that doesn't help you for this chart. This chart is all kodashim. So hani chalamandi le Rav Papa. If you hold by Rav Papa, that works. El lamanda late to Rav Papa. If you don't hold by Rav Papa, ma'ikal amemer, what are you going to be able to say? There, the answer is no. So you're not going to be able to get to a yes here by a kavachomer. Okay, so we have a different kavachomer. So we're going to have 2 possibilities. One is if you hold like Rav Papa, and one is if you don't hold like Rav Papa. If you don't hold like Rav Papa, we'll give you a different kavachomer. And it's very simply, instead of taking the kavachomer argument from case 5 of a hekesh, gezeira shava to hekesh, we're going to go to gezeira shava and gezeira shava. Okay? And we're going to say the following. Ela kavachomer. Uma hekesh she'eno melamei behekesh. We're going to start again with case 1. Hekesh is very weak because you can't do a hekesh on a hekesh. Imi derive, imi deravina. Whether you go by Rava or Ravina, again reminding you which case. And yet, melamei b'kavachomer, midetana debeir b'yishmael. And yet, case 3, the answer is yes, right? You can do a kavachomer after a hekesh. So, gezeira shava, hamilamed b'gezeira shava chaverta. If you can do a gezeira shava and a gezeira shava, in other words, what they're comparing here is hekesh to hekesh, gezeira shava to gezeira shava. Okay? So, if you could do gezeira shava to gezeira shava, midarami bar chama, as Rami bar chama taught us. In this case, it's interesting, even though we have, right, Rami bar chama with the murbechet and Rava with the rosho kra'av and the or basar and peresh. They don't go back and say Rami bar chama or Rava. They just go back to Rami bar chama. I don't know why. But, so from Rami bar chama, eino din shetelamei b'kavachomer. So again, case 6 shows that gezeira shava is obviously more likely that you're going to be able to make a limud after it, because you could do a gezeira shava and gezeira shava, and you can't do a hekesh on a hekesh. So, therefore, you must be able to do a kavachomer on gezeira shava, because you can even do a kavachomer on a hekesh. It's always going to go back to that case 3, because that case 3 is really what's telling that, right? If you can do a hekesh, you can't do anything else after hekesh, but you can do a kavachomer, so that's going to show that you should for sure be able to do a kavachomer on a gezeira shava. Can you do a binyan av after gezeira shava? And the answer is teku, because here we don't have anything to build off, because we don't have an answer for davar lamei hekesh. Can you learn a binyan av? And certainly we don't have a yes answer. Even if we had an answer, it was no. So we really don't know whether you can do this, and they leave it at that. Okay, here it gets a little more complicated. Okay, now we're getting to the davar lamei kavachomer. You're going to see all of these are kavachomer arguments. Okay. So if you learn something by kavachomer, can you do, again, hekesh? Can you do gezeira shava? Can you do kavachomer? Can you do binyan av? So davar lamei b'kavachomer, maushi lamei b'hekesh. So they're going to answer kavachomer. Now, again, they're going to go back to different cases. Uma gezeira shava she'ena lemeida b'hekesh. Now here they get a little bit confusing. Because if we compare before, hekesh, can you learn hekesh? Gezeira shava, can you learn gezeira shava? This time, first of all, they're going to change the language. They're going to start with the words gezeira shava, but they really mean a hekesh to a gezeira shava. Hekesh is first. Okay, before when they wanted to say that, they said a hekesh, right, that she'eno melamei behekesh. Okay, they start with what we have on the right column and they go to the left. Here the wording starts out the opposite. It's talking about a gezeira shava, but it's ena lemeidan, there's different girsaot, but min ha-hekesh, meaning really, hekesh. Once you have a hekesh, you can't then learn a gezeira shava. Okay, they're talking about case 2. When you have a hekesh, davar lamei behekesh can't teach you a gezeira shava. And what's confusing here is what they're now going to do is they're going to talk about the comparison of hekesh to gezeira shava and gezeira shava to something else. Okay, to hekesh. They're going to do it with the gezeira shava is they're showing it from 2 perspectives. What can you learn gezeira shava after a hekesh, and can you learn a hekesh after a gezeira shava? which is case 5. Okay? In more simple terms, it's very hard to understand this in the wording. I mean, it's not so hard, but it's confusing. But we're basically comparing case 2 and case 5. Okay? So let's read it inside again. And hopefully this will make sense. So here's our cover. We're trying to figure out, can you have a kavachomer and then a hekesh? So they're going to say like this. Gezeira shava she'ena lemeda mina hekesh. I'm going to change the wording based on the comments, okay, in the side notes. A gezeira shava can't be learned after a hekesh. Mida Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, if you have a hekesh, you can't learn gezeira shava. That was Rabbi Yochanan. Otherwise, we could have learned kodashim from chatat. And yet, it's milamed behekesh. So even though gezeira shava is weaker, because it can't come after a hekesh, it can come before a hekesh. That's, I think, the simplest way to answer it, right? Gezeira shava can come after a hekesh, but it can't come before a hekesh. How do we know? That's case 5. That's Rav Papa. You can have the gezeira shava sham, and then a hekesh shlamim toda. Okay? Mida Rav Papa. And obviously, we're going to then say, what if you don't hold like Rav Papa? But right now, we're in Rav Papa. So kal v'chomer halamei behekesh, if you can now we're going to fill in the blank. Instead of saying gezeira shava, we're going to do kal v'chomer. If a kal v'chomer can come after a hekesh, then obviously it can come before a hekesh. And kal v'chomer, then hekesh. That's all we're doing. If gezeira shava can't come after a hekesh, but can come before a hekesh, then a kal v'chomer, which can come after a hekesh, can obviously come before a hekesh. So that's what we're going to read right now. How do we know? Right? If it's milamed, so kavachomer halamei behekesh midatana debei Rabbi Yishmael, that was the et bedam v'tfilah. We had kavachomer after we had a hekesh. Eino din shilamei behekesh. So of course it should be able to teach you a hekesh after the kavachomer. Now hani chalamadi le Rav Papa. Obviously this only works if you hold by Rav Papa. So again, if case 2, right, which doesn't work, but case 5 works, then case 3, which works, is going to lead to case 9 must work as well. Okay, that's in numbers. But anyway, we explained it already in words, so now we're going to move on. So if you hold like Rav Papa, that works, because case 5, Rav Papa says yes. But Elalamanda Leile, the Rav Papa, if you think that gezeira shava can't come and then teach a hekesh, can't learn a hekesh after gezeira shava, ma'i kalameimar, answer is teku. We don't really have an answer here. Okay, and again, once you see the chart, you can see we're learning from case 5 because 5 is right under 9, right? They're all within the same case of can you learn from here to a hekesh, can you learn from here to a hekesh? Davar lamei b'kavachomer, maushi lamei b'gezeira shava. Okay, can you take a kavachomer and then learn a gezeira shava? Let's see. So again, we're going to have the same kind of logic here. Kavachomer. Uma gezeira shava she'ena lemeda behekesha. Now again, this is case 2. You can't have a gezeira shava after a hekesh. Okay, that's case 2. Rabbi Yochanan. Mida Rabbi Yochanan. Otherwise, it would have said kodashim and chata'ot, right? Learn from there. I mean, it says kodashim. We would have learned from there to asham. You can't do gezeira shava from a hekesh. And yet, milamed b'gezeira shava. Now go to case 6, because we want to be in the column of yilamed b'gezeira shava. So if hekesh and then gezeira shava doesn't work, but gezeira shava and gezeira shava work, and now we're going back to our case 3, which we always go to. So if you move to kavachomer, halamed behekesh, if you could do hekesh to kavachomer, then obviously you could do hekesh to gezeira shava, right? And that's mitan debei Rabbi Yishmael, that you could do hekesh to kavachomer. Then eino din sh'talamei b'gezeira shava. Obviously, in other words, again, kavachomer is always going to be easier to learn because the kavachomer is the only one that you could learn after a hekesh. So therefore, in other words, but we're switching. In that case, it's again as we did before. In the case of case 3, we did hekesh then kavachomer. Now we want to say from kavachomer you can obviously do a gezeira shava because if gezeira shava you could do gezeira shava, and gezeira shava was weaker in the hekesh one, because you can't do a hekesh gezeira shava, then obviously you should be able to do kavachomer and then gezeira shava. Okay, now we get, if this wasn't complicated, this is the most complicated one, because the Gemara is going to ask this question on it, you'll see. Davar lamei b'kavachomer, maushi lamei b'kavachomer. Can you have a kavachomer on a kavachomer? Just for this whole question, if the whole kavachomer is based on this is kal, this is chamor, then a kavachomer and a kavachomer should obviously work, because you're just going to the more chamor, right? The whole kavachomer is based on this logic, which it's like the transitive property, but I'm not going to get into that. But it's interesting. Davar lamei b'kavachomer, can you then have a kavachomer? So kavachomer, it's a kavachomer argument, and here's where we're going to get a little trapped here, but you'll see. Uma gezeira shava she'ena lemeda behekesh. Okay, now we're going to go to case 2. You can't have a hekesh and then a gezeira shava. And that's Mida Rabbi Yochanan. Milamed bekal v'chomer kidamaran. Now here's the first one that we're actually going to prove. Here we say kidamaran. Notice he doesn't quote any rabbis because it's not rabbis. This is learned out from a kal v'chomer argument. There we're going to have a weak point here. Because now we're going to go back to case 7, which makes sense. I just want to point out, right? In case 9, the first one of the kal v'chomerim, we went back to case 5, which is the one right above it in the chart. Case 10, we went back to case 6, which is the one above it in the chart, right? We did 5, let's learn it from. Then we said, let's learn from 6. And now this one obviously is going to be learned from 7. But what's the problem? 7 itself is learned from a kal v'chomer. So it's going to be a little tricky, okay? Because the whole question is, can you learn kal v'chomer from kal v'chomer? And now we're learning, the whole logic is based on a kal v'chomer. There's too many kal v'chomers here, you're going to see. So we start off with a kal v'chomer argument. We say the following. Gezeira shava, which you can't learn from hekesh, which is case 2, and yet it's milamed b'kal v'chomer in case 7. A gezeira shava, right, you can't do hekesh gezeira shava, that's case 2, but you can do gezeira shava to kal v'chomer. So the same gezeira shava, which can't come after a hekesh, can come before a kal v'chomer. Okay, and how do we know that? Midamaran, because we had a kal v'chomer argument for that. Kal v'chomer halameh mehekesh. So now we're going to have a kal v'chomer which can learn from a hekesh. The one we always go back to, case 3. That shows kal v'chomer has more power than other things. Eino midatana de Rabbi Ishmael. Eino din shilameh b'kal v'chomer. So obviously that should be able to teach you another kal v'chomer after that. And v'zeu kal v'chomer ben kal v'chomer. And then they basically kind of admit, there's a kal v'chomer argument that's used to teach you a kal v'chomer, about kal v'chomer. It's a little ironic, okay? But the Gemara says, what are you talking about? This isn't a kal v'chomer ben kal v'chomer, like a 2-generation. This is ben benoshal kal v'chomer. This is a 3-generation kal v'chomer. Because what's basically really bothering them is, yes, we're making a kal v'chomer argument for this whole thing about a kal v'chomer. But what's more bothering them is it's all based on case 7. And case 7 itself was learned out from a kal v'chomer. So they don't like that, because that is like there's too many kal v'chomers here. So they reject this. Ella, and basically, if you think about it, if we're trying to say, that was the whole question, can you learn a kal v'chomer from a kal v'chomer? And then you're learning it using a kal v'chomer, which means, right, you're kind of answering the question without answering the question, because that was the whole question. Can you do it? And you're saying, well, let's take this kal v'chomer and let's learn it from there, but we don't know if you can learn it from a kal v'chomer. So what they're going to do is they're going to neutralize this case 7. They're going to say, forget case 7. We're not going to use case 7 because case 7 is all premised on a kal v'chomer argument. Instead, we're going to use case 3. Okay, we're going to see how this works. Ella kal v'chomer. It's a different kal v'chomer, and we're going to learn it from something that's learned out from a Tana de Rabbi Ishmael, and not right from a real drasha, and not from a kal v'chomer, and that's going to resolve it. Uma hekesh she'eno lameh behekesh. Right, that's case 1. Can't do a hekesh on a hekesh. Imi derive, imi deravina. Right, either for one of those reasons, and yet milameh b'kal v'chomer, but it can teach you kal v'chomer case 3. So midatana de Rabbi Ishmael. So now kal v'chomer halameh mehekesh. So now a kal v'chomer which can be derived from a hekesh, we're now using this in both directions. You can do a kal v'chomer from a hekesh, which is also case 3, midatana de Rabbi Ishmael. We're using it in 2 directions here. Eino din shilameh b'kal v'chomer. So if you can do a kal v'chomer after a hekesh, obviously you could do a kal v'chomer after a kal v'chomer. That's basically what they're saying, and that one works. V'zeu kal v'chomer ben kal v'chomer. This you can actually use, because that's only 1 generation of kal v'chomer and not 2. You didn't use too many kal v'chomers here. Okay, a little confusing. Last one. Okay, what we're missing here is the binyan. We're going to get to those tomorrow. What about a binyan? Can you learn all the other things? But now we're going to do the kal v'chomer. Can you learn a binyan? And here we actually are going to have an answer, not like with the previous ones. You need to know a little background here. Nevela is a dead animal, and there's tuma to a nevela. Dead animal, tuma if you touch a nevela. Okay, if you carry a nevela also. A bird that was, okay, and by the way, if the animal was a treifa and you slaughter it, there's no tumat nevela. Okay, tumat nevela is only on an actual animal that just dies on its own, that wasn't properly slaughtered. If it's not a kosher animal because it was sick and you slaughtered it, it's not a nevela. It doesn't have the impurity of a nevela. A bird, a kosher bird, has a different kind of tumah. It's not mago masa, and it's a weaker kind of tumah because it's only if you were to eat it and it's in your mouth, the dead bird, kosher dead bird, it's called beit habliya. While it's in your mouth, you carry impurity. The third thing you need to know, so one is tumah nevela for an animal, and that shchita prevents it from being a nevela, even if it's a treifa. We have shchita of a bird, and there's a nevela of a bird which has its own tumah beira blia, and we have malika, which is the way you do shchita in the temple. So now we want to have a binyan av on a kal v'chomer. So what's our case here? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Tashma. Let's learn it from here. Malak v'nimtzei treifa. If you did malika in the temple, which by the way, malika outside the temple, it would be a treifa. You can't do it, but malika is a way you slaughter in the temple. It's you don't slaughter it, you kill the bird in a different way. Malak v'nimtzei treifa. So what if they did malika in the temple and it turned out to be a treifa? So Rabbi Meir Omil, ena mitama bebeit habliya. There's no tuma nevela there. Okay, just like in an animal, that's going to be our binyanav. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Omer mitama bebeit habliya. He thinks it does. Okay, we're not going to get into Rabbi Yehuda right now. Rabbi Meir is what interests us. I'm a Rabbi Meir. Kal v'chomer. Here's the argument. Ma nevela behema shemitama b'maga umasa. Nevela behema is more severe. Here's going to be our kal v'chomer. If it has a more severe law of tuma, because it's mitama b'maga umasa, anything it touches will be tame. Shchitata, and yet when you slaughter it, it's mitaheret treifa tami tumata. If you slaughter an animal, then there's, even if it's a treifa and it's not kosher, there's no tuma nevela. So nevela of she'eno mitame b'maga umasa, here's the kal v'chomer. It has a lighter level of impurity. Shouldn't shchita, if you slaughter a kosher bird, should be no treifa, it should be not tuma nevela, and that's shchita. So that's our kal v'chomer. What about malika? Well, mamatzinu. It's about mamatzinu, a paradigm. Why are we going to make a paradigm from shchita to malika? Because shchita outside the temple is like malika inside the temple, so it's the same thing. Mamatzinu b'shchita shemachal ba'achila. Shchita allows birds to be eaten, and also mitaheret treifa tami tumata. And it means if you have a treifa and you slaughter it, it's not going to have tumat nevela. So af malika shemachal ba'achila tetaheret treifa tami tumata. So malika, which allows something to be eaten, should also prevent tumat nevela from coming. So there you have the binyan av from shchita, and the shchita was learned out from a kal v'chomer. Okay, so our summary of our daf is basically this chart. Okay, all these drashot, hekesh, gezeira, shava, kal v'chomer, binyan av, how do they interact? If you have one and then the other, does it work, does it not work? And all the different opinions. Some we learned out from drashot, and some we learned out from kal v'chomer reasoning. And with that, we finish today's quite dizzying, complicated daf, and wishing everyone a good day.